Hey, Vass, I've got a question for you to start off today. Can you predict the future? Have you ever predicted something correctly? How did you do it?
I mean, I want to say that, yeah, for sure, I've predicted things correctly, but I don't think I wrote them down. I don't have the evidence for you. I do love to make like little bets in conversation, ask people what they think is going to happen with something and sort of register mine, but I never put any like money down or anything. I do rely daily on probabilistic weather predictions, and I do have friends who really like deeply buy into star charts as being like deterministic of someone's life. And I'm superstitious, but other than that, I'm no magic 8-ball.
Well, deterministic universe, we could maybe line up a guest on that. But today we're going to talk about forecasting and forecasters. It's been a tough time for them on most fronts in recent years, like election forecasts, economic forecasts, etc. It reminds me of one thing, which is Warren Buffett once said, what are you better off with, a financial analyst or a monkey throwing darts at the stock list, right? And his estimation was you're actually better off with the monkey because they cost less. Right. Okay. So who are these forecasters anyway?
Well, we're not interviewing a monkey today. We are in luck. We've got a great guest who can explain and sort of demystify these realities of forecasting. Robert de Neufville is a super forecaster and more.
Yeah, and super forecasters are able to consistently outperform others. That sets them apart. Even experts, like they do better in those areas to be a super forecaster.
Now, Robert became a super forecaster 11 years ago in 2014. He did that by being among the top forecasters in a major forecasting tournament. We're going to ask him about that. He's researched different issues, including the rise of catastrophes that are severe enough to threaten human civilization. You know he's fun at dinner parties. He's contributed to The Economist, The Washington Monthly, The National Interest, and California Magazine. And he has his own podcast, but today we're welcoming him to this one.
Indeed. Robert, welcome to Policy Prompt.
Thanks. It's great to be here. And I do want to say I am fun at parties.
Robert, do you remember like where you were when you first heard this term, super forecasting? What did it spark for you? How did you get into it?
You know, memories are always a little bit confusing when you go for, a little ways back. But I think the first time I heard it was an interview on NPR with a forecaster named Elaine Rich, who was great, who I later came to know, basically talking about the Good Judgment Project, which is what I signed up for immediately after hearing that. I thought I would be good at it. Before I signed up for that,
wait, why did you think you'd be good at it?
Because I estimate probabilities anyway. I think for me, it's a little bit of maybe a neurotic habit. Like if I'm stressed about something, I ask myself, what's the realistic probability that it'll actually happen? And that's a way of making myself feel like I'm more in control of the situation or something. But I've kind of always sort of done that. But also, when I was in grad school and sort of failing to write my dissertation, I spent a lot of time on an early ancestor of those fantasy sports sites called ProTrade. And I basically won every competition initially. They changed the rules at some point and made it so that you had to spend a lot more time than I should have while I was trying to write my dissertation. But initially, it was essentially predicting how well athletes would do, how well football players would do their stats in advance. And it wasn't hard to win. I think I was one of the only people in this small site that was actually using any systematic method for estimating on the basis of past performance, how they perform in the future. And it gave me a huge advantage. So that's basically the same thing that I ended up doing in the Good Judgment Project.
So there's obviously rigor to this. It's not some kind of, just loose judgment methodology. Like it has to be rigorous. But like, what can you tell us? Like, what is super forecasting? And can you talk a little bit about that famous or infamous tournament that determined that super forecasters were at least 50% more accurate than those of regular forecasters?
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions there. I'll start with the term super forecasting. I actually don't know exactly what that means. I'm not being facetious when I say that. People talk about super forecasting. So when they did the study, they did this. All right, I will back up. The tournament was basically set up by a government agency called IARPA, which is sort of the intelligence agency equivalent to DARPA that, is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And they wanted to figure out, could anyone forecast geopolitical questions? Because it turns out people are pretty bad at it as far as they hadn't found a lot of people who are good at it. And the Good Judgment Project entry, originally it wasn't the Good Judgment Project, that was the name of one of the entries in it by Phil Tedlock and Barb Mellers. They identified a bunch of people who were consistently good at it, and they called those people super forecasters. So when I joined a little bit after that process had already started, I really wanted to be a super forecaster. I worked really hard at it, and I was among the top people. I qualified as one of the people who was consistently better than others. What I say when I don't know what super forecasting means, so it's a registered trademark of the Good Judgment Inc., which is a spin-off, the professional spin-off of the Good Judgment Project. And it's a great trademark. They market it a lot, but it's not totally clear to me what super forecasting as like a gerund or whatever that is means. So super forecasters are people who are able to predict more accurately, consistently than most people, right? But super forecasting is sometimes used to refer to what I will generally call judgmental forecasting, which is sort of the thing that I'm doing, which is essentially making a probabilistic estimate of what's likely to happen.
Okay.
And it's sometimes used, I think, to refer to the techniques that good forecasters use. It's hard to specify exactly what those techniques are. They sort of worked backwards from what good forecasters did.
Yeah. And tried to give it a name.
It's not identical to what super forecasters are in some sense. So they market this super forecasting thing. They'll teach you how to do it better. I'm not sure it's a rigorously defined academic term. Okay.
Well, it's definitely not just a party trick, right? We've already determined you're fun at parties and we want to have you at parties.
I don't actually know any party tricks.
It's also different from like the, pleasant ambiguity of a horoscope or like a fortune cookie. So there's technique and kind of terms of this trade. Maybe you can help us benchmark it against things like some websites that take the average across a suite of public opinion polls to kind of make a prediction. Where do we situate judgmental forecasting against that kind of analysis?
Well, public opinion polls aren't really forecasts at all. You can use them to make a forecast, but a poll is basically a snapshot of what people think at a given time, right? And we think that if we do a poll of how many people are going to vote for, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, for example, that'll reflect how many people ultimately do that intention to vote. But there is a difference there, right? Like I am extrapolating from a snapshot, which is already a statistical artifact and maybe not totally accurate in the first place. So yeah, polls are really useful in making forecasts, but they're not forecasts.
So one thing I wanted to dive into a little bit, like as I was trying to get my head around it, like what kept coming to me was that super forecasters are really disciplined at parking their bias and preconceptions. That's kind of a trained art a little bit, right? And we all fall into it from time to time. But presumably the super forecasters are better, that allow them to outperform experts in their own domain. But what does that template look like? Like, is there some kind of number crunching, probabilistic, kind of math going on here? Or is it just each super forecaster has their own template?
I think each super forecaster has their own template. It does involve a lot of judgment, which means it's hard to sort of say, like, here's the brute force calculations that you could do that would always get you to an accurate answer, which is why it's hard even for the top AI models to compete with the best human forecasters right now. There is a technique. I think it does vary a lot from forecaster to forecaster. I'm not constantly trying to do cognitive debiasing. I try to be aware of my biases and know certain topics like American elections where maybe I'm too invested to see them clearly. But there are techniques, right? I think what I would describe, I often compare it to a skill like playing basketball, right? Some people have more natural ability in that they might be taller or be more athletic or something. But there are also techniques you can use. There's shooting form you could use to ensure that your shot goes straight every time. So we do some of those things. There are, in general, the best guide to what's going to happen in the future is the past. If you ask me what's going to happen in a certain situation, the first thing and the most important thing I'm going to do is look back at similar situations in the past and try to establish a base rate of what's happened, how often things have happened in those similar situations. That's a little bit complicated. That itself requires judgment, because I have to say what situations of the past are meaningfully similar to the question you're asking about. And there may be a lot of different ways to do that. And sometimes a good thing to do is to look at it from a bunch of different ways and triangulate the probability out by saying, well, maybe it's like these situations, maybe it's like those situations, if I'm not sure what's a good comparison. But fundamentally, I am trying to see how often things have happened in the past, establishing a rate, sort of a normal rate at which certain things happen, and then work from there.
Okay. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about your habits when you're on this forecasting court, right? Like, what do you read and pay attention to as you sort of build your pulse and kind of constantly keep all this historical knowledge at your fingertips?
Well, a lot of it is about knowing what to research and being a good researcher in a certain way. By good researcher, I mean knowing what information is likely to be meaningfully useful. The research shows basically, you might hear this idea that experts are no good. They've been compared to the dart throwing chimp that you were talking about, that they basically, you might be a subject matter expert, but your forecast about your domain isn't necessarily any better than random. The fact is that you don't often need great expertise to forecast something. A smart person can come up to speed on the essentials for a lot of questions. So where the forecasters are good isn't necessarily their subject matter expertise, although as a group, we tend to be widely read across a wide range of things. But it's specifically the skill in estimating probability given certain sets of facts. So a lot of what I'll do when I'm given a new subject, I mean, elections, I've done a lot of election forecasting, right? And not just in the US, but like in countries I don't know very much about the politics of. But you can look at the frequency in which things have happened in other elections and do that kind of research and figure out sort of roughly how often things happen. So that's the kind of thing I will do to come up to speed on a topic I don't know about. And in a lot of cases, I really don't know that much about it in advance.
Policy Prompt is produced by the Center for International Governance Innovation. CIGI is a non-partisan think tank based in Waterloo, Canada, with an international network of fellows, experts, and contributors. CIGI tackles the governance challenges and opportunities of data and digital technologies, including AI, and their impact on the economy, security, democracy, and ultimately our societies. Learn more at cgionline.org.
So let's dive into a specific example of this as well. Like one thing that we were looking at was this new crowd forecasting site called Glimt, which was launched by a Swedish defense research agency. You probably know about it, Robert, that in cooperation and with support of Ukraine. And the questions that they have asking for input over the recent couple of days was A, will Russia withdraw from Syria? B, will Russia use a nuke on Ukraine in 2025? C, will Russians protest the war in 2025? Or D, percentage of the Donbass controlled by Russia in the fall? What are these things seem to be proliferating? Do you see those as useful tools in all of this, or is this something aside and kind of a side issue?
I thought it was kind of bonkers to read about too, by the way, right? Like asking citizens, like, what do you think will happen with these major geopolitical elements?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not the guest.
No,
yeah, totally.
You said I probably know about that. I don't know about that. I feel like I should know about that site. There are a lot of things like that. In some ways, fundamentally, those are the kinds of questions that we were asked in the Good Judgment Project. And we were just regular citizens. You can ask regular citizens those kinds of questions And often you'll get really a lot of garbage because some people really are not thinking about it in a systematic way. But those are the kinds of questions that a good forecaster can produce meaningful, useful probabilities about. I don't know exactly how the site works and who's getting asked and how they're trying to aggregate it, or what kind of signal they're getting, how they're aggregating the probabilities and how useful that is. But that's the kind of thing that super forecasters look at, for sure, those questions.
You mentioned garbage. I mean, do you pay attention to garbage? Do you need to factor that into your work? I'm curious what people kind of consistently get wrong about this discipline, your discipline, and what annoys you about that.
Oh, that annoys me. I'm annoyed by a lot of stuff.
Me too, by the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of annoying stuff. I'm actually not that annoyed by it, but there are definitely times when someone will make a forecast, and often pundits will make a forecast, and I'll think, oh, that's just totally wrong. Like, I don't even know that much about it, but that's insane. I think there are certain, well, first of all, pundits, right? And this is something I talk a lot about in the research. They have an incentive to spew out hot takes, right? So a sober forecast probably isn't that interesting. So a lot of the forecasts you see on TV or whatever by some talking head are terrible. And they don't pay any price for it because nobody remembers that they got it wrong. And they'll just go back often and say they got it right. So there's not really, nobody keeps score. One of the things that's valuable about the research is they started keeping score and seeing who actually was doing a good job of it.
Who's keeping score, though? Like, who's they? It's not just, it doesn't seem like it's just everyday people watching, or just tell me more about who's keeping score.
Well, in the original project, they would evaluate our forecasts for how closely they fit outcomes. And essentially what you do is, if you're asking about a discrete event, like will, Trump win the election, either that happens or it doesn't. So if I say there's a 50% chance that he'll win, that's a terrible forecast. That's like flipping a coin. It's not useful. If I say there's a 60% chance that he'll win, and he does, well, you would say the outcome was a 1. It happened with 100% frequency. And I said 60%. So that's not very useful on its own, just as one forecast. But if I make 100 of those forecasts, you can basically see how well my forecasts are correlated with outcomes. And essentially, the more closely they're correlated, and this is, you may have heard about a Breyer score. This is what a Breyer score does. The more closely they're correlated, the lower your Breyer score is, the better your forecasts were over that big collection. So that's how they keep score. Now, now that I'm making forecasts on my private Substack, or my personal Substack, nobody is really keeping score except for me.
And so the data centers.
No one's reporting on it other than me. But that's how you do it.
So yeah, one of the, obviously with the internet, with Twitter, X, all these social media platforms, there's a lot of couch or sofa surfing predictors and forecasters out there. One of the ones that comes up all the time, of course, is artificial general intelligence. How close are we? When is it happening? And a lot of the companies themselves fuel this, right? And so Sam Altman, OpenAI, recently came out on X saying, the rumors about AGI are Twitter hype, and there's lots of cool stuff coming, but chill out and cut your expectations by 100x, right? Like, there's so much out there. Like, comes back to that question before of like, what do you pay attention to, and what do you just kind of totally ignore? Like, and maybe a comment on AGI as well, if you're willing.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think a lot of the skill of the forecaster is figuring out what's hype and what is meaningful signal, just finding the signal in the noise. It's tricky with AGI, well, for a variety of reasons, but I hadn't heard that Sam Altman said that. Typically,
it's like 2 days ago or something, right? It was very recent.
I mean, it's not, on some level, it's not surprising, but Sam Altman and the other heads of AI companies are trying to raise a staggering amount of money. So they've actually been talking some of the stuff up.
According to recent online posts from OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, one of the most meaningful AI breakthroughs may be coming faster than most people would believe.
And I tend to discount that, because if you're trying to raise whatever it is, $2 trillion, you need to tell investors a pretty good story about what they're going to get back about it. And it's like, trying to buy a car or something. They're not, they'd be totally honest with you about what they're selling.
Right.
What? Car salesmen are being totally honest. You guys.
Well, that's the thing is if somebody,
it.
Something seems like a sale pitch to me.
The new used car salesmen of this age are the kind of promoters of a lot of these, fancy toys, right?
That's what I think. But I will say I have heard buzz from people who are more connected to artificial intelligence, from AI research I was talking to actually just last night, that there is people at OpenAI are kind of whispering that we're close. And that's where some of the hype is coming from. Now, I don't think that means we're necessarily close. You would expect some people to start saying we're close a little early. Also, it's not that clear that AGI is a well-defined category. It's not what exactly happens when we get there. This is all talked about in kind of vague, loose terms often. But I think we probably are close to some meaningful breakthrough. What's happening with the current models is very impressive, and they're systematically flawed in some ways. But those flaws are probably patchable and could be patched pretty quickly by using things like chain of thought techniques and maybe, expanding the context window so they can be more aware of the world around them. So these kinds of things may make a big difference. Now, I personally don't think that we're about to reach some threshold that's going to lead to godlike magic AI powers. I'm skeptical of that story, although, very smart people disagree with me on that. But I think there's a good chance that sometime in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a pretty impressive breakthrough that will transform some things. I want to add about that before you ask me another question, though.
Sure.
Things like AGI are very difficult to forecast because I said that the best guide to the past, the future is the past, right? There's no past on this. We've never really invented artificial general intelligence. So I can't tell you how often that happens. I can maybe look at some other technological breakthroughs and try to extrapolate. This is how often technological breakthroughs happen.
Like printing
But
press.
there's a lot about this situation that is unprecedented and unique.
Yeah.
That's also a problem with trying to predict something like the use of a nuclear weapon, right? That has barely ever happened. Right? So there are certain things that because they're so rare and because there was maybe no possibility it could even happen with nuclear weapons, there was no possibility it could have happened before they were invented. There was no possibility AGI could have been invented 100 years ago. So it's very difficult for me to say, well, this is how often that kind of thing happens. So for unprecedented things like that, maybe no one's good at doing that. I can use my reasoning, but that's not really what the best forecasters have mostly been doing.
Well, do you want to stay in the space of catastrophe a little bit? Like maybe we could make some of this work more concrete. You mentioned, talking to an AI insider just the other night. I'm super curious to know what you're keeping your eyes and your mind on right now, maybe for a future post on the private Substack. I know it's public, but I just like that you mentioned that.
I don't know
the
why I said
combination
personal
of private and
comment.
Substack, personal. I get it. Maybe walk us through it a little bit more, some of your thinking as detailed as it is appropriate to be.
Yeah. So as you mentioned up front, I used to work as a researcher for a nonprofit that looked at the risk of global catastrophes, things that are sort of large enough to affect the entire planet and maybe change the course of human history or something. And one thing is that, for most of our history, most of the global catastrophes you could think of would be natural, like a super volcano or a meteor or something like that, or a pandemic, which is... could be artificially induced, but, has a natural component in any case. But as technology has gotten more and more impressive, we have a new capacity to harm ourselves, potentially, with our powerful technologies, like nuclear weapons, potentially like strong artificial intelligence that we're not totally in control of, maybe with, biologically engineered diseases, right? So there are new things to worry about. And now probably the big risk to ourselves comes from us. And as it gets easier and easier to do certain things, like maybe engineer a disease in your garage, then you would think the chance of these things happening goes up. So that's always been my big concern. What am I worried about right now?
Yeah.
I'm a little anxious about artificial intelligence. As I say, I don't really believe the runaway singularity story, but it's not totally clear that we can control the impact of what we unleash on the world. And so I have some anxiety about that. Nuclear weapons are always still a concern. One concern is very related to artificial intelligence. Some people think there is or should be an AI race between the US and China.
Why? There's a Chinese startup that few people had ever heard of until the past few days, and it has emerged as a real player in the AI arms race. It's called
in this story, if the US is getting close to some powerful transformative AI, then maybe China has the incentive to try to stop us violently, right? So I don't think the risk of nuclear war went away when the Soviet Union disappeared. I mean, there's also still Russia, right? So I think there's still some risk of nuclear war, the risk of biologically engineered diseases or lab leaks is not gone. It's real. I don't think COVID was a lab leak, but it's not implausible that it was, or that there could be a lab leak in the future that did even worse things. So those are the kinds of things that I'm more anxious about in terms of global catastrophes.
Right. There are a lot of nuclear weapon powers, including North Korea. So the list is quite long. But one of the blog posts that you made at the beginning of 2025, Robert, was you basically said, expect surprises in this brave new world. So how do you factor in those surprises or even black swans? Is there something that has shocked you? Could you give an example of something that's just like, this was truly a black swan in the way you thought about things, or just give us an example of a surprise?
I guess one of the big things for me is how American politics and global politics is changing. I didn't think Trump would win. I thought I gave Kamala more than 50% chance of winning. I think in hindsight, that was a mistake. Obviously she didn't win, but given what I knew, I think I probably should have had a higher chance that Trump would win.
But did you not want to admit that, or were you listening to different things?
If you're asking if I was biased, probably. I find it difficult to get inside to imagine why someone would vote for Trump, if we're being honest. And that makes it difficult for me to conceive that lots of people will. I know that intellectually. But I think it's not so much that I didn't want it to happen, so I thought it wouldn't, because I'm often very pessimistic about things. But I think there probably was some how could people vote for this guy that was affecting my forecast. But it's not totally irrational either, right? In the past, a lot of things that he has done would have been disqualifying, right? So when I say surprises, I think that American politics has changed so that the norms that were, very firm that you couldn't really disregard, you can now disregard. And I don't know where that takes us. And it's not just the US either. This is something that's happening, I think, all over the world.
It's global.
So I'm expecting some stuff at the political level to happen that would have been inconceivable for, much of the post-World War II era. I don't know exactly what, but some of the things that we would thought, that'll never happen, is probably going to happen.
Right. Actions that are wildly off course or unpredictable get reactions that are wildly off course or unpredictable, right?
Yeah, and I also just had this general sense that people were kind of in a weird place. I think a lot of it is post-COVID. The people really were fed up, and a lot of it is prices, but it was a hard period for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of anti-incumbent, anti-system energy, and I don't know where all that goes. We're going to see in your Canadian election what happens, but I think we got an anti-incumbent vibe there too, right?
Oh, definitely. Definitely similar vibes. I mean, it's fascinating to hear that phrase, right? Inconceivable or incomprehensible, and then also kind of couple or root it in a conversation about forecasting. If we can come back to your history as a prolific pro trader for just a second, it strikes me.
It was a 2 or 3 month period, I should say.
Oh, yeah, right. No, I know. Still, right? Like just that rooting, and because you mentioned that platform, fast forwarding to now, it does strike me that it feels like almost everything is kind of being, this isn't a real word, but gamblified, right? Like in the US right now, you have the poly market platform.
While poll after poll showed the presidential election in a dead heat.
Look, this is our running average of the polling averages in the battleground states. They're all close.
In the world of online prediction betting, a different picture emerged. Crypto gambling site Poly Market showing that a majority of users thought Donald Trump would win in the final week.
It's not as popular, or I think maybe allowed in Canada. And you have Kalshi, right? Like prediction markets are all the rage, and like every little outcome in the near term is turning into a bet. We wondered what you saw as being some of the dangers of the expansion of that world, right? Like where's that line between it being kind of playful and engaging to maybe being closer to gambling or something that's more addictive? Like how should we think of, I'm asking you 100 questions. How should we think of it, and what does it say about outcomes in the world?
Yeah. Well, I'm not that worried about the gamification of everything. I think that for people with gambling issues, it's pretty serious, potentially to expand it. A lot of stuff still isn't really legal in the U.S. I think under the Trump administration that, there may be less enforcement of those past things. But like, you could bet on politics at Betfair in England for a long time. We've been sensitive about that in the U.S. They don't like it when you bet on American politics because maybe there's some idea that you're going to get rich by influencing it or something. We couldn't. Right. There were no American political questions in the U.S. Good Judgment Project because they didn't want us. I don't know. It was uncomfortable in some way. I don't think it's so bad, and I think those prediction markets did a better job than a lot of the skilled forecasters than I did for the U.S. election. And I think probably for the right reasons, they were picking up on a signal that I was missing. And sometimes that can be really good. But so it's useful, potentially. You can get useful information. Maybe you could even hedge against political risk by using those kind of prediction markets. But I'm also not as optimistic about the potential of them. I think that the reasons to get involved in prediction market, one of the main reasons is it's fun. And that really makes the markets for things like major elections pretty viable. But, you're not maybe going to go on a prediction market to do some boring question. So the boring questions don't get answered very well unless there's a lot of money in them. And that's sort of already being handled by the stock market. So, at some point, a lot of people were creating markets like, should I date this person? Well, that's not going to work because your friends, you don't have enough friends to really give you good information about that. And they're all probably biased. They have their own ideas about what you should be doing. In order for that to work, there'd have to be millions of dollars at stake, and people would have to be monitoring you and trying to figure out your personality and stuff that you wouldn't want anyway. But so there's this very prediction markets can solve all of our information problems. I don't think that's true. On some level, you're probably better off just paying good forecasters. You have a specific question you want to answer because the prediction market's not going to open source it for you. But I don't think they're super harmful, except potentially as more gambling.
Fair enough.
Right. One thing that strikes me about it is that there is this, let's call it tokenization of everything. Digitalization of everything. It's global. It's 24/7. It's kind of an adrenaline rush, right? You get onto a prediction market and there's people from around the world. Like, isn't there a chance of this being quite transformative, right? That all of this stuff, like to Vass's point, that it's, whether it's gamification or tokenization or whatever, there's a convergence of platforms and activities, right? That are creating this whole new kind of interaction and the implications of that seem to not be insignificant, regardless of what they're talking about or outcomes.
I think there's certainly a chance. I mean, as a forecaster, I often feel there's like a chance of a lot of different outcomes. I'm not super certain of everything, of anything really. If you're super certain, a lot of times you're overconfident. But I don't know. I don't know if I believe it's going to be super important. You're right that people are doing more and more of this, but I'm less convinced that we're going to be betting on everything in our lives anytime soon. I think it's
right, like your dating
a
example.
little bit of a flash in the pan, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not personally attractive to me. Like I don't engage in something like that, but I do observe the kind of environment of advice shifting. You were mentioning, friends, kind of small sample sizes, to people seeking advice in a way that's maybe more performative, more open, more implicitly reliant on crowdsourcing, like posting your personal problems in a viral Reddit thread. I don't know what we're trying to accomplish there, and I have no question about it for you. I'm just kind of telling you.
I don't know.
What about any connections to kind of that growth of self-directed investing and autonomy, sort of taking things into your own hands, not relying on expertise, kind of becoming the expert? Do you see that as an extension of the broader kind of forecaster thinking?
You see jokes on Twitter or X or social media platforms sometimes that every time there's a new news event, everyone becomes an expert in a new field. You first you're an expert in epidemiology, and then you're an expert in fire management. Yeah, tariffs, whatever it is. And it's a little bit funny because that is sort of what we do as forecasters, right? We go from subject to subject and try to get up to speed on them. But I don't really recommend that everyone try to be an expert in everything. Like, it's just not worth your time. You should rely on other people's expertise. And it's a little bit tricky, right? Because then you have to figure out who are the people to rely on. And, I can't give you a really hard and fast rule to distinguish the, junk science from the real science if you're just logging on the internet for a few minutes. But in general, you have to rely on the expertise of others. I can't be an expert in everything. I'm lucky if I can come up to speed on one subject, for a brief period of time. So I am a little concerned, if we're being honest, about the turn against experts. I think that we should, continue to trust experts and institutions. And I understand why people don't. There's a lot of reason to be angry about society and the advice we're given, and people get body horror about vaccines. But no, vaccines are good. They've saved a lot of lives, and I don't want to see polio coming back or people's kids getting measles or whooping cough. So I wish we would pay more attention to experts, but it is really difficult for me to tell people, here's how you know who the real experts are, because it's not that simple. It's a practice of distinguishing real information from mis or disinformation.
Yeah, it feels like that toolkit, like the ability to pick the right information, the most credible information is going to be one of the key things going on. I just saw some stats yesterday about the news source or information source that Canadians are using, and it's spread across traditional media, print and TV, to Facebook, to just raw kind of, Twitter and X feeds, to specialized or local news, to kind of, Reddit chains like that, and these kind of things, right? Like, it's just unbelievable how spread that is. So it's even more difficult to say, I'm going to trust this expert. You actually have to pick which lane you're even looking in first, right, for that information.
Well, I think it's really hard because I don't think it's not obvious that the way to make money is to provide people with accurate information. If you're Facebook, you don't really care whether or not people are paying attention to your website because you're providing useful information or because you're making them angry or exercising them. In fact, you probably can get more engagement by providing disinformation. So right now, I think that a lot of these sites have a business model, which is to provide junk. And you can't really blame people for lapping it up. They are, that's what it's designed. It's designed to trick you on some level. And I think with a media ecosystem where you used to have, one paper that covered a big geographic region and an ad model that doesn't work today, maybe they had a different incentive, although there was always been yellow journalism and stuff like that. But right now, I don't think anyone has a an incentive to help you distinguish real facts from fake facts.
Right.
There was a report. So up here in Canada, in the Great White North, the federal government has a shop called Policy Horizons. And that shop uses strategic foresight to help the government prepare for future impacts. And recently in a report, the kind of most probable near-term hideous thing they could envision happening was that within the next 3 years, people wouldn't be able to tell what was real or what's not in the media ecosystem. I feel like I'm already there. I'm like, guys, I'm in the future. There's lots of stuff I have to ask my friends, like, is this real? And kind of guess and check. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how cognitive forecasting does link up to or influence policymaking and or intelligence communities. You know, there's that playful element we talked about in terms of, you know, playing around in prediction markets, but there's also, I think, really interesting connective tissue to public governance institutions.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, I would say, I think we're in a different media environment, but at the same time, this has always been a problem. We've always been in kind of a Red Queen race between disinformation and you know, as we can fake more images, people have to learn that some images are fake. And that's just been going on forever. I would recommend that you be skeptical. It sounds like that you're saying you ask your friends, well, maybe your friends aren't the best source. I don't know your friends. But in general,
they're good.
Asking yourself,
Asking
yourself, is this right? Is it too convenient? Like, it sounds good to me. You should probably be doing that with information you're getting. You shouldn't trust any information that comes to you. You should have a little bit of skepticism when it comes in. And that's the way to be a better information consumer. As far as like the policy thing, forecasting has been kind of, when they discovered that some people like me were relatively good at forecasting, there was a lot of excitement. Like, oh, we can use this information. They're gonna come in and policymakers are gonna do different things because of it. And that didn't really happen. And it's turned out that it's actually pretty difficult to use the kind of forecasting that I do to change policy. So if I say there's a 8% chance of a coup in a certain country, it's not obvious what you as a policymaker do with that information. Is that even a lot? Maybe you're not, don't have a set. That is kind of a lot. But like, you maybe don't know exactly how to use that. So it's turned out that really what policymakers need is a more rich understanding of what the forecasts mean rather than some point probability. So it helps a lot to ask a lot of different forecasting questions about one subject, to look at the forecaster's rationale for why something might happen or might not happen, to have counterfactual forecasts or conditional forecasts, where you say, if something happens, then what will happen, right? And look at the consequences, because policymakers need to understand how things work as much as they need some blank, all else being equal, this is what's going to happen. But it's tricky. Like, the example I like to use is a little bit with the COVID pandemic, right? Let's say you want to figure out, you're a government policymaker, you want to figure out, should we impose a mask mandate, right? So you might ask a forecaster, let's focus on the mask mandate. How many deaths will there be in this region if we don't impose a mask mandate, and how many deaths will there be if we do? Right. So that's a way to try to get at the consequences of a policy, right? But what's tricky about that is that forecasters will say to you, probably, good forecasters will say, there are going to be more deaths if you impose a mask mandate. And that's not because they think the masks are going to cause the deaths, but because they know there's not going to be a mask mandate unless the pandemic's pretty bad, right? So mask mandates are associated with more deaths because they're a sign of them, right? That's how you get the mask mandate. So it's actually really difficult to make forecasts in a way that gets at the consequences of policy questions. You'd have to ask something like, today, given what we know right now, what would happen if we impose a mask mandate? But it's a little bit tricky because you can't really score that question or see how well you've done because you can't evaluate the all else being equal part of it. So making forecasts useful has been the big problem for people who are trying to sell them, like the Good Judgment Project, or like the Swift Center, which I work with as well. they have to figure out how to make the numbers useful for policymakers.
Right. I'm thinking about a lot of the work that we've done, we've actually couched it in scenarios. And the reason why is that we started off with some projections. I wouldn't even call them forecasting. We're saying, okay, well, who's going to grow in terms of economic growth? What do the demographics look like? What's the debt level? How well are they doing on innovation? You can do fairly well projecting those out. But then it comes down to a lot of other variables. So we kind of pitch this in terms of various scenarios based on the data and projections. And that tool seems to work quite well with the policy community. It gets them thinking about different alternatives and options and things. Do you find that to be a helpful way, or how do scenarios relate to what you're working on or forecasting?
I think it's useful. I think that it gives you a way of breaking it down a little bit. I'm sometimes a little bit leery about scenarios because people tend to anchor on them. If you say, here's a thing that could happen, people maybe overweight the realistic possibility that scenario will happen. But I think that's the kind of thing you need to do. You need to look at different types of circumstances and ask yourself, well, what might happen in this type of circumstance? And I think you need a lot of communication with policymakers. You really want to talk to them about what they need to know and what, in designing forecasts. It's not just about having me predict a probability. It's also about what are the right questions to ask. In order to know that, you need to work with the policymakers and figure out what their issues are, I think. That's what we're discovering.
I'm going to follow a sports analogy here with a doubleheader and go right away to another question. And that is, when you mentioned your own story about, kind of the sports, what attracted you, it makes me think of a lot of buddies I had who were obsessed with sports stats and things like that. And I can see how, the betting markets, the prediction markets have kind of come out of that in a certain way, right? Like you think of that movie Moneyball, was it called, right? Where it's but it mostly seems to be guys. Is this somehow something that just really appeals to guys, or is it somehow kind of an exclusive space? Are there many women involved in this, or is it for some reason just a kind of a guy thing that are really dominating it?
Well, I'm not a expert in gender really, but there are certainly fewer women doing this kind of geopolitical forecasting that I'm doing. I don't know exactly why that is. I think there is something about the analysis. I mean, maybe sports even more so, but something about the analysis that appeals to men. But I also think it has to do with just generally being fewer women interested in geopolitics for social and cultural reasons that aren't even about appeal, but historical. I wouldn't even be able to do that analysis, but
right.
There are a lot of reasons why you don't have as many women in some of these fields, and that carries over to geopolitical forecasting.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know on the poly markets and things, just what the gender numbers are there. Maybe it's just more men playing around with these things at midnight more. Maybe
men are more performative with it. I mean, I'm only half kidding there, but what's a prediction if you don't share it? For anyone listening, of any background who's interested, how does one start to think about learning how to engage in this kind of the work of forecasting? Or, I mean, I think you mentioned a way that people could pursue training. Where should people start? Yeah.
So, I mean, if you just Google, there are some guides to some of the techniques.
Yeah.
I recommend Good Judgment Inc., which is, as I said, is a spinoff of the original Good Judgment Project, has something called Good Judgment Open, where they post questions you can look at and try to predict. And in some ways, it's like any skill. The best thing to do is to practice. And you try some of these questions and you think, my forecast was bad on that one. What did I do wrong? It really helps to try to figure out what you did wrong after you do something wrong, right? And that's a really good way to get good at it. And you can also do things, you can also use prediction markets and stuff. Metaculus is a really good resource. They have a bunch of questions that you can take a look at and try to predict. And It's just a practice talking to people on the site about the forecasts and reading their rationales and asking yourself, do I agree with that? Do I not agree with that? And that's how you get good at it, I think.
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but the idea that we're in a moment where there are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of those pieces are chaotically moving. Some of them are political actors, some of them are states. Is there such a thing as kind of a meta forecast in the sense of like when there are that many moving pieces and that much kind of volatility, let's say, in the system, does the chance go up of some kind of something really breaking, right? Like it's a moment where you know something's going to go wrong. It's either in Europe or it's in the South China Sea, or there's going to be something go wrong, because the chances overall are higher, even though you don't know what the it is, or you don't need to specify what the it is. Is there such a thing as a meta kind of forecast in that sense?
Well, I think you mentioned my prediction that you should expect surprises, and that's a little bit my throwing my hands up and saying, I don't know what's going to happen in 2025, but I think that's a meta forecast. Like, I think that there will be more of those surprising things. Now, in any normal year, there are some surprising things. You know, you have millions and millions, billions of events. I don't even know how many things you would want to categorize as events. Some of them are going to be pretty surprising, just by random chance. So they're always going to be, it certainly shouldn't be a surprise if something happens in the South China Sea. But I think my meta forecast is that there may be more of that this year because of innovations in artificial intelligence, because of the political ferment and so on. So that is kind of a meta forecast, I think.
Right. And when a surprise happens in a messy system, the surprise can have a bigger consequence, right? Like, if your car is starting to break down and you got a problem, you're thinking my car's in trouble, and then you have another surprise, that surprise can be a lot more serious at that moment than under normal circumstances, right? It's not a great analogy, but you know what I mean. Right.
I do know what you mean. I think that a lot of the things that I would predict, like political things, are a messy system. It's like the weather. Not everything in the human world is like that. It's pretty easy to predict population growth, for example. We can probably do that normally far in advance. But politics is a complex system. You have a lot of agents that are adapting to one another. So it's a little bit like the weather, in which a small thing that happens can totally shift us into a new state. And that makes it difficult. And if more of that small stuff happens, we may be more likely to be perturbed into a totally different world. I think that's probably true.
And I've just got to say that, like, we work on the Center for International Governance Innovation. We're very focused on technology governance as being one of those key variables, right? And you're just seeing it across the board, whether it's, AI, as we've talked about, or quantum technologies emerging, whether it's disinformation, outer space, there's just so many moving pieces right now, and they all feel like there's some surprise element that's very, very possible there, and way too many loose ends.
Well, I would be surprised if we're going to Mars anytime soon. There seemed to be a lot of hype about some outer space stuff, and that's going to move pretty slowly. But I think that's right. I think there's a lot of... I'm sometimes amazed by how little technology has changed. Like, it's been huge in some ways. Medical technology, information technology has been huge. But, we're still fundamentally driving the same cars we were when I was born. They're different cars, but they look pretty similar, and they're functionally pretty similar.
Retro station
it's
wagon.
Weird how some things don't seem to change very much at all, but then under the hood there are these huge innovations where cardiovascular treatments are much better than they were when I was a kid.
Or there's just more surveillance everywhere. It's also funny just to think about the future. You mentioned outer space. Some of the time, as a working / overworked by myself, toddler mom, I'm sometimes like, wow, will my son go to outer space? Like, is that the closest I'll get to outer space? Like, what would it feel like to watch my son shoot into the upper, out through the atmosphere?
Will he be required to go?
Yeah. Right. Would he need me? Anyway, is he allowed? Different questions. Listen, more seriously.
Do you let the toddler go to outer space? What are the rules in your household?
Yeah.
I actually, when he was a tiny baby, I would talk to him, and sometimes I was like, you know what? If you go to outer space, you have I think we should go together. I don't know if you can go alone because I'll just miss you so much.
That's sweet.
Yeah. I hope that didn't deter him. So I want to ask you a slightly more serious question. You've gestured at the kind of upside downness of the world right now, kind of curveballs. unpredictability and we're still kind of sticking with, we can make educated guesses about future events. What's something that you think our listeners should keep in mind either about the future going forward or how to think about it?
Let me just say, I like the phrase educated guesses because that's basically what good forecasters do. They make good educated guesses. We're not getting visions of the future from Apollo. We're just a little bit better at making educated guesses and do it systematically. As far as like thinking about the future, I think Steven Pinker is roughly right that the trends are generally positive. And, I was on a podcast recently and they wanted to ask family planning advice. Should you bring a kid into this world or are things going to get worse?
Yeah.
And I'm not really qualified to give family planning advice, but I think generally things are getting better. If you look back, we're so much richer, our health is better. It always feels bad. Every moment feels bad. I feel bad about American politics, but I would have felt bad about American politics in 1960 too. So I think that things are generally getting better. I don't think it's a guarantee. I don't think there's some kind of Hegelian necessity that we all reach some perfectly good egalitarian Star Trek future. I don't think Hegel was into Star Trek, but I think things could go wrong, right? Like I'm worried about authoritarianism and democratic backsliding, and I don't know for sure that the world keeps becoming more democratic. I don't know for sure that our lives get better. There could be a catastrophe of our own making that gets them worse. I'm not ruling any of those things out, but my general sense is that the trends have been positive, and overall, with some local disruptions, will probably continue to be positive, for as far as I can see.
I like that as a note to end on. I'm finding that helpful, even though you mentioned authoritarianism and, stuff like that.
It's a way I relieve my own anxiety.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for being with us today here, Robert. And it was a pleasure to meet you. And thanks so much for these ideas and comments.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah.
Really interesting conversation. Thank you.
What do you think, Vass? Do you have any thoughts on what we just heard there? Any predictions of what comes next? Anything at all? Reflections?
You and I are chatting the week of the Trump inauguration, and I find myself feeling very kind of emotionally and cognitively destabilized. I feel things are uncertain, things are changing fast. I'm not sure how Canada's going to change this year. Everything seems very noisy. So I find myself attracted to this idea that, with the right information and the right data, we can kind of peer around the corner. So yeah, I love talking to Robert and understanding, his discipline and his field and how he's trying to kind of help humanity and help people think about what's most likely to happen, but also we have to be ready for what it feels like when things go totally sideways. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with these meta forecasts in general, so I gravitate towards that kind of stuff, and I think it comes out here a lot. Like one example that we didn't ask specifically, but it's like, how healthy is democracy? There are problems on the horizon, right? Authoritarianism, etc. But the question would be, will democracy be gone, in half of the current democracies 10 years from now, or, that kind of thing. I'm not sure that that the super forecasters would say it is going to be gone, but they'd probably very much say it's going to be a rocky road, and that, you've got to, you gotta work. We got some work to do, right? Like to keep that going and keep it healthy in all countries, pretty much, right? Like you see it in Europe now, you see it in South Korea, you see it in Canada. Are there any democracies that are totally smooth? I don't know, Iceland. Like they're not too many, right?
For now, where do you read these? Like, where do you go for meta forecasts? Like, do you have any sneaky places online that you sometimes check out that you're learning from?
I think it's a compilation. It's kind of like what we said of like, what source do you go to? Like if you want the truth on something, the truth, I mean, exaggeration, but you want the best information you can find, you got to probably pick a couple of platforms and a couple of sources and then make your own judgment between them. So it's kind of like that for meta forecasts too, in my mind. If you got a whole bunch of information, like what's your big takeaway of it? And then you got to throw in that surprise factor. That's the killer, right? Because it's kind of like, okay, well, you're right if all these things happen, but what about that one X factor that if it happens, it blows this totally out? And the chances of an X factor happening are probably like 10%. Like he said, there will be a surprise in 2025. There will be. Is it economic? Is it health? Is it an individual? Is it war related? Like, is it conflict related? Like, it's one of those things that's going to happen. Yeah. Which one is it? We don't know.
And one thing we didn't get into with him is, we were probing a little bit on how governments can kind of harness this discipline, right? For better or for worse. One wonders how you learn, and maybe that's a bridge between scenarios and forecasting. What can you do in the interim to increase, if anything, the likelihood of the probability that you want to have happen, right? If we know what some of the huge risks are now for our future, how can that be instructive to our direct tomorrow instead of something that's ambiguous?
I mean, my final takeaway would be that, like, you need those kind of redundant, thoughtful systems, right? And this is where the military tends to get things better than many other organizational entities, where you've got constant challenging of what you think is going to happen because you kind of have to plan, right? And the war gaming and all that stuff. Like, we don't do enough of that in the economic planning, the social implications of things, and government tends to just become a little bit of an insular inside the beltway, as they call it in DC, or Ottawa kind of air, and there's not enough outside thinking. Like, we should institutionalize that more. And I'm not talking about tooting our own horns, but just structurally, you want people challenging with kind of wild ideas and what ifs out there more than we have. Fun times. It's going to be 2025 will not be boring, Vass. I predict that. Okay. I don't know. Do you have any other predictions? And the one other thing I want to say is, another prediction I have is that I think everyone on this call agreed that we may be happy about some things. There'll be some optimistic, outcomes and all that, but we will still be unhappy with politics under any scenario. That seems to be a solid prediction, is that people are grumpy about politics no matter what, no matter when.
We're in our grump era. I like that. Yeah. I mean, look, I prefer even numbers to odd numbers, so I'm already a little nervous about 2025, but it's kind of an even number, because if you think of 25 as being quarters or how it's a square root, you can get some evenness. So that's my glimmer of optimism in my strange personal numeracy.
You're waiting for 2028.
Numerology, I meant. Oops. Yeah, I'm waiting for 2026.
You're waiting for 2028 or 2026. That was it? Not 2028.
No, I'm waiting for 2028 big time. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in another episode to reveal what the 28 means.
Sounds good. Policy Prompt is produced by me, Vass Bednar, and Paul Samson. Tim Lewis and Mel Wiersma are our technical producers. Background research is contributed by Reanne Cayenne. Brand design by Abhilasha Dewan, and creative direction from Som Tsoi. The original theme music is by Josh Snadelaga. Sound mixing by François Goudreault. And special thanks to creative consultant Ken Ogasawara. Please subscribe and rate Policy Prompt wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay tuned for future episodes.